Let me begin by saying the American Horse Council was formed in 1969 to serve as the unified voice of the equine industry in Washington, D.C. We are a bipartisan advocacy organization that seeks to address the social, economic, and legislative issues of the U.S. horse industry. As you are no doubt aware, the industry is very diverse, and that means at times we don't all see things the same way. So our policy at the Horse Council is to work on issues where we have consensus or we can build solutions, coalesce around solutions. When we have differences of opinion on things, to avoid further divisiveness, the council speaks to all sides of a subject, but we remain neutral on that topic. And today we are going to hear a number of items, and we hope that you will find this informative, educational, and useful. We are using Zoom as our platform today, so please be sure to mute your line if you are not speaking so we can cut down on background noise. We are going to use the toolbar along the bottom. There is a place to chat. So if you have a question or a comment, feel free to throw it in the chat, and we will come around to that subject. If we can find a way to unmute ourselves occasionally, we might ask some questions or have some content. We'll give you a nudge to say unmute and contribute to that. So with that, what I want to do is turn this over to our committee chair, which is Dr. Tom Lenz, and our staff liaison, which is the director of our Health and Regulatory Affairs, which is Cliff Williamson. So with that, Cliff, I'm going to admit these last couple of people, and I am going to make you the host.
Welcome, everyone. Excuse us for that. Dr. Lenz, do you have any opening statements you'd like to make or comments you'd like to share?
I'd just like to welcome everybody. These are hard times. I wish we were together in person. I guess the good news, I was down at the Arabian Nationals over the weekend, and that show seemed to be running just like they always did. So maybe there's some hope here in the future we'll get back to a normal show and race season. So let's go ahead and start off. If you'd like to introduce Mindy, that'd be great.
Well, welcome everyone. To start off, I'll introduce everyone who's not an actual member of the Equine Welfare Committee. Our official Equine Welfare Committee charter is established in 2018, states the Equine Welfare Committee will monitor existing and emerging equine welfare issues that are of concern to the horse industry, identifying and prioritizing concerns and opportunities. We evaluate related information and determine actions or activities that may be appropriate for the horse industry. And our first presenter for today is Minnie Patterson with the Cavalry Group. She's going to discuss the Working Animal Protection Act legislation and her efforts at the state-by-state level to push the Working Animal Protection Act. She is the president and co-founder of the Cavalry Group, LLC, regularly advocating for and defending the constitutional and private property rights of law-abiding animal owners and animal-related businesses.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be with you all. And these Zoom meetings are pretty great. I wish I could see everybody. That's a little frustrating, but here we go. My presentation, the actual PowerPoint is pretty brief. I'm just going to give an overview of the Working Animal Protection Act, and then I'll reduce the screen so that we can be in this gallery setting again for any questions. So with that, is my screen sharing? I see what I did wrong. Is that working now?
Now we've got you.
Okay, very good. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay, well, so as you all are very much aware, animal-related businesses, animal ownership and animal enterprise has been the cornerstone of our country for centuries. But today, those who raise, breed, and work with animals are in the fight for their very existence. And it's happening through this erosion through legislative policy at the local, state, and federal levels, through very deceptive legislation that is being pushed through an emotional agenda. And there is a huge difference between animal welfare and animal rights, which you all, I know, I've spoken to this group before. I know that many of you are acutely aware of the difference. But just for the sake of discussion, as we all know, that animal welfare endorses responsible use of animals to satisfy human needs from food, clothing, medical research, and companionship, and that animal welfare engages in the practice of husbandry and ensures that animals that are used by humans have all their basic needs fulfilled, such as food, water, shelter, veterinary care, oversight, and so forth. So that is pretty basic framework of what we would consider animal welfare. But animal rights is an ideology based purely on emotion, no science or facts, and it advocates that animals are essentially equal to humans. It also advocates for the rejection of all animal use, regardless of how humanely the animals are treated. Now, that is a very important point when we go forward and start talking about the legislation. So keep that in mind. So again, you know, a lot of these animal rights groups want these animal-related businesses and animal use to be completely eliminated, regardless of how humanely the animals are treated. So you could be perfect in every way and they want you gone. And so with that in mind, it's also important to remember that the animal rights ideology is a political agenda that is eroding incrementally our public view and our society's view by altering Americans' views about animal ownership and animal use through the media, through our schools, through legislation, and even through litigation, which we experience regularly. Their goal is to end use of animals in every possible capacity. This is I'm sure you've all seen this web before. It's an important thing to keep in mind because the animal rights industry, as I call it, is a very well-funded industry globally, 400 million and growing. But a lot of these groups sound cozy and like they really truly care about animals and their intent is to advance animal welfare when actually what they're doing is eroding our ability to animal ownership through legislation and regulatory reform. So when I was in Texas supporting our Working Animal Protection Act 2 years ago, there's a group in Texas called the Texas Humane Legislative Network. And before I go to a state to testify on legislation, regardless of what side, if I'm for or against, I always check out the local animal rights groups. And down there, it's the Texas Humane Legislative Network. They're very well funded, very large group in Texas. And this phrase was on their homepage: legislate to decide their fate. So whose fate do you suppose they're talking about? Well, they're talking about yours and mine and all animal related business. They will legislate us away. And I always tell people, you know, you need to pay attention to what's going on at the local, state, and federal levels legislatively, because the legislative battle is ground zero to protect your animal related businesses. This is a very perfect example of, and I don't expect all of you to be able to read this because so quickly, but it's important for you to know that these are all the list of all the legislative bans at the local level that have taken place in the last 7 years across the United States. And this is the equivalent. All of these legislative bans are in 62 local ordinances, 28 states, banning everything from horse-drawn carriages, pony rides, exotic animal exhibition at fairs, county and local fairs, elephant rides, camel rides, circuses, you name it. And so all of these things are essentially working animal. There's even some local municipalities across the US that have been attempting to ban working dogs as well. So canines, seeing eye dogs, and they haven't passed, but yet they have been, it's something that has been proposed and we've been battling from the animal rights groups. So this is, you know, necessity is the mother of invention. And so because I have been trying to catch up with all of these different local ordinances for the last 10 plus years, I realized we needed to go on offense. So I got together with a friend of mine who is a state representative in the state of Missouri. His name is Representative Brian Spencer. And in 2015, we sat down with legislative council in the state capitol in Missouri and had a conversation about how can we go on offense. We need a piece of legislation that can stop these local bans, legislative bans, to completely ban horse-drawn carriages and other working animals. And we came up with the Working Animal Protection Act. This legislation, it's important to keep in mind that, and I will share with you the language. It's very simple. It's a 4-paragraph bill. Legislators love us because of that and love the legislation. We have a tremendous amount of bipartisan support. But what really grabs lawmakers is the fact that they really had no idea that this kind of thing was happening to animal-related businesses. In fact, in Missouri, if you go back, look in the middle column and look under Missouri, you see Richmond and LaBelle. Lawmakers in Missouri didn't even realize that local bans had happened in our own state of Missouri. The ban on the display and exhibition of exotic animals. And in LaBelle, there's a livestock ban within city limits, this is in Northeast Missouri. Totally floored lawmakers in the state of Missouri. And because we're such a huge agriculture state, that did not sit well. In addition to the fact that, these bans are an outright attack on lawful businesses, because a lot of these businesses that are utilizing working animals in exhibition, transportation, education, and entertainment are all licensed and inspected, definitely at the local level and oftentimes at the federal level as well. So, and depending on where you are in the scope of things, they could also be, there's oversight at the third level, at the local level. So imagine having your livelihood banned because your legal business doesn't align with some lawmaker's ideology. And this is the case for these legal businesses that utilize working animals, which have all come under attack across America by these animal rights groups that have been pushing their agenda and ideology with photographs and false information to lawmakers. Now, it's important to note that the Working Animal Protection Act does not protect unscrupulous or illegal operators. And it's also important to note, and we've worked out the kinks over the last few years with this legislation, because a lot of the outcry the first year that we rolled this out was a lot of lawmakers were like, we don't want to take away local control. Well, it doesn't take away local control at all. All this bill says is that local political subdivisions, city councils, county councils cannot ban outright legal businesses utilizing working animals. And it does absolutely nothing to interfere or eliminate or alter local, state, and federal laws or statutes that regulate these animal-related businesses regarding public health and safety. A lot of the city council members and county commissioners are always concerned about public health and safety for the animals as well as the people. And this does absolutely nothing to interfere with laws that are in place to protect citizens at the local level. So that we have completely ironed out any concern on that and made it very clear in the legislation. And also it just basically doesn't allow, it prohibits an outright ban on legal businesses in entertainment, exhibition, education, and transportation. One other important point I have to make, and I've always included this in testimony, because as you well know, oftentimes we have suburban and urban members on House Agriculture and Senate Agriculture committees. Nowadays, more and more, we're seeing suburbanites and urban people having a seat on these legislative committees representing agriculture. But it's really important, as I remind them, that eliminating access to working animals, whether they're banning animal exhibits or traveling educational exhibits in schools or libraries, especially horse-drawn carriages and other working animal related businesses, it takes away opportunities which provide affordable options for less fortunate and underprivileged residents in both urban and rural areas to view and experience these animals up close. It's just a shame to see these carriage companies and go out of business because of a local ban on horse-drawn carriages in these local municipalities. They add such a spark to the cities, and to see the interaction with families and young people, it's something that we just can't afford to disappear. So what we're also promoting here with this legislation is a protection of our horseback heritage and our horse-drawn carriage heritage as well. Here's the legislation. You can find a copy of this, and I'll give you the website in just a second. But as you can see, this is the whole kit and caboodle. This is the 4-paragraph bill that essentially amends the agriculture statute in each state. So for Missouri, this was in 2020, this year, this was House Bill 1752. And this, what you're reading here, is the perfected version, and it was poised, it had passed both the House and the Senate Ag Committees. It had passed the full House, 108 to 40, had a lot of bipartisan support. It was poised and ready to go to the Senate for a full vote, and then COVID hit and it all fell away. But this is it, and it's a very simple bill, and I'll show you where you can go to download this for the language if you're interested in learning more. This in 2021, we are already filed or ready to be filed in Oklahoma, Texas, Missouri, and most likely Iowa, Kentucky, Maryland, hoping for Florida, and Montana. So those are the states. And we really, we're already spread thin with us introducing this bill in so many states. So we want to focus on states where we feel that we stand a decent chance to get this done. So we're not going to be introducing it in some of the states that you can imagine where this wouldn't stand a prayer. So again, this is the list of all the local municipalities that has banned working animals at the local level. So, and there are some state bills listed in this as well. And all, again, at the website I'm going to give you, you can download this Leave Behind. Important to note, at the top of the center column is Chicago. We lost the Chicago carriages in earlier this year, and that was a complete debacle. The city council, all 55 members, voted in favor of it to ban horse-drawn carriages in the city of Chicago. And some claim that they didn't know what they were voting on during their Zoom meeting, and it was just a mess. Anyhow, that's what the most recent ban that took place. So you can go to WeSupportWorkingAnimals.com, and there you will see pretty much earlier this year, we kept a blog on the status of the legislation in all the states where we were moving the bill through. You can download a copy of the legislation. You can also download a copy of the Leave Behind. Coming up on 2021, as things advance, I will be updating this website. So everything will be fresh and starting over. This is just the homepage of that website. So you can download, everything is downloadable. You can get copies of everything you need there to learn more about the bill. I'll also share too that you're welcome to go to our website at the Cavalry Group, and we track legislation. Typically when I give talks on fighting legislation at the local, state, and federal levels, I go into a description of all the different bills that are taking place at the local, state, and federal level that are basically working to erode animal enterprise. But we track all legislation at the local, state, and federal levels, and you can find that information on the Take Action tab, and looking at the flash map on that drop down on that tab on our website at thecavalrygroup.com. So with that, I am going to stop my share and hand it back over.
Okay. Let me get my presentation back up. Dr. Lenz, you will be the next speaker once I can close out of all these screens. Well, actually, I don't need to. You have a presentation.
Just kick
Next
it
up on
over
the
to me.
agenda is Dr. Lenz. He has a presentation regarding his efforts with the Wild Horse and Burro issue and from his seat on the Wild Horse and Burro Advisory Board within BLM. Dr. Lenz, I am making you a host now.
Okay. So I'm going to run through quickly an update on the wild horse and burro situation. As you know, the Wild Horse and the Bureau of Land Bureau of Land Management's Wild Horse and Burro program under the 1971 Wild Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act, they're responsible for about 27 million acres in the wild horses and burros on those lands, and you can see them on this map to the right. They divide those up into horse management areas, and there are about 177 of them. Their goal is to provide healthy horses and burros on healthy public range lands and to protect the health and welfare of the animals in the public lands and to care for and place excess animals into good homes. And so right now, it's been estimated that the appropriate management level on wild horse and burro lands is about 27,000 animals. And currently we have about 95,000 burros and horses on that range. And that doesn't take into account, that was in March of this year, that doesn't take into account probably somewhere between 12 and 16,000 foals that were born. So we think that there's probably in excess of 106 to 110,000 animals on the range today. And there are an additional 50,000 animals that are held in short-term and long-term holding pastures. When those animals are captured, they're branded and microchipped, and the stallions are castrated, and then they're put up for adoption. If they're over the age of 10 and they're not adopted, when they're put up 3 times, then they go into long-term holding pastures on pastures and ranches out, primarily out in Kansas and Oklahoma. I think what a lot of people don't know is they only manage the animals on BLM land. There are also horses running on U.S. Fish and Wildlife land, on National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, military bases, and state managed lands. And then there's a pretty good sized population of horses, and I don't think anybody knows for sure, but we think there's an excess of 150,000 horses on tribal lands. And a lot of the tribal lands butt up against Bureau of Land Management lands, so there's movement back and forth by the horses, and there's mixing of the horses across between the tribal lands and the BLM land. So here's the big challenge with wild horses. They are extremely reproductively efficient. You know, we select our horses for speed or conformation or competition or athletic ability. Wild horses and burros select themselves for reproductive efficiency, and so nearly every 2-year-old mare will be pregnant, and most of them will foal up into the early 20s. They have no natural predators. There's a couple of herds up in Northern California that have mountain lion predation where they hold the herds down to zero increase, where they kill all the foals. But most of the herds are safe, and horses are pretty smart, and they tend to move to areas where they're not natural predators. Currently, sheep and cattle and livestock that's run on BLM is managed very strictly, and if it's a dry year, they cut back on the animals allowed on the range. If there's not very good forage, they cut back on them or shorten the grazing season. Wildlife are managed through hunting, but the horses are not really managed. They're removed, but they're not managed, and that's one of the big problems. We have a low rate of adoption, and we'll talk about that in a bit. The fertility control that we're using today is primarily PZP, which has to be given annually or every other year. If there's a pelleted form that's injected, they can dart the horses with the yearly PZP, but on average, they only put PZP in about 700 horses a year, which doesn't have a lot of effect. And we'll talk about some changes coming to hopefully change that. I think one of the biggest problems is the American public views horses as a symbol of the West. They almost have a mystic quality to people. And so most of the public's perception of how these horses should be managed is based on emotion. and very little understanding of how these horses interact with the range and wildlife and other animals. And because of that, they have a significant influence on Congress, which then limits the Bureau of Land Management. I'm completely convinced that the BLM can manage these herds very efficiently if they were allowed to use all of the tools in the 1971 law, but Congress limits that quite a bit what they can do, and so it's caused most of our problems. One of the big problems with overpopulation is that it puts the herds at risk and it puts the animals at risk. And with the droughts we've had in parts of the West, there's a significant problem with keeping these herds healthy. And most of the gathers that have taken place in the last year have been emergency gathers where they had to go in and remove a bunch of horses because they were starving to death. And if you look at the two pictures on the right, they're the same location and almost the same camera angle. And it just shows what happens. That's a water tank. It shows what happens. Horses tend to hang near the water a lot more than natural wildlife does. And they also will forage. If there's not grass available, they'll eat bushes and tree bark and everything else. And so they can really destroy the habitat, which has an effect on wildlife if they're not managed properly or removed when indicated. And the other problem we're starting to see in the drought areas is these horses are moving into towns and cities and onto golf courses and private land. And so it's caused some problem with uh, the public, and it's also increased the death rate in horses on highways and so forth. And especially we've seen that with burros down in Arizona around Phoenix. There's been a lot of those burros that have been hit by cars. So I think the big thing when you're looking and trying to understand the wild horse and burro issue is to understand the concept of exponential growth. And I think the easiest way to understand that is these horses don't, when we see the herds increase, it's not a slow, gradual increase. It increases in velocity and angle over time. And I always tell students when I talk to them, if you put one algae in a pond, and in 30 days the pond was full of algae, what day was the pond half full of algae? And that's the 29th day, not the 15th. And so here's a real example here. In February of 2016, they had 27 horses in a horse management area, a herd management area. February of 2018, they removed 1,400 of those horses, but they had foals born in 16, 17, and 18. And so at the survey in May of 2018, they still had 2,700 horses. And that's because the herds expand exponentially because the mares give birth, half of them are fillies, the fillies get pregnant, they have fillies, and they increase. PZP is the main contraception that's been done. Last year we put about 700 doses in horses. There's a few herds that are pretty well the Pryor Mountain herd where these horses are almost semi-domestic and they can dart them. But horses are pretty smart and you have to get within about 40 yards. And so you may get them darted one year, but it's a little more difficult the next year and it's a lot more difficult the third year. So most of them have to be captured in order to use the product. They've tried gender ratio adjustments where you turn more stallions loose than mares once you catch a herd of horses. That doesn't work because 40% of the mares are bred by young satellite stallions rather than the herd stallion. And some herds have 2 or 3 stallions that share the mares. Chemical and surgical stallion vasectomies are not effective because, again, the stallion, we can castrate, do vasectomies on stallions till we're tired, and it'll have very little effect on the fertility rate. Intrauterine devices work, but you have to put them in a mare that's not pregnant. And these mares are pregnant usually by the time they're 2. And so there's been some discussion, and I think we'll talk about this in a bit, where if we can get these mares on PZP for a year or 2 and keep them from foaling, then we can put intrauterine devices in them. They will usually stay in for 2 or 3 years and cut back on the number of foals. The primary thing that's used to control the herds are gathers and removals, where they just gather a herd of horses and remove them. So in 2018, they've gathered 11,000. That was a lot, mainly because of the droughts. 2019, a little over 7,000. And on average, they remove about 6,000 horses a year. Permanent sterilization of mares, there's been a lot of discussion about that. I was on a National Academy of Science committee looking at research projects, and we endorsed that, but there's a lot of opposition to it by the public. I think they don't understand what's involved in spaying a mare. Unrestricted sale is allowed, but not done because the Congress won't allow it. And so there are a few hundred horses that are sold each year, but they're mainly sold to other government agencies like the Border Patrol or the military. Adoptions, last year we had 7,000 adoptions, which was the highest we've had in years. And on average, we adopt about 3,400 horses a year. If you look at the cost, expenditures for 2020 are about $87,000. You can see that short-term holding and long-term holding take the most, and most of the budget. And when you look at population suppression, it's a tiny sliver of the population. And so we're spending most of the budget on warehousing horses right now. Something that's kind of interesting, if a horse is captured and adopted within 2.5 years, we'll spend about $8,000 on that horse. It costs about $1,000 a horse to capture. If that horse is put in long-term holding, and most of these horses will live up to 25 years or so on pastures, we'll spend about $48,000 per horse. So one real success story that was started last year is the Adoption Incentive Program. And that's a program where the Bureau of Land Management will pay you $1,000 to adopt a horse. They pay you $500 up front when you pick the horse up. And then after 6 months, the horse is inspected and your progress is inspected and everything looks like it's fine, then the additional $500 is paid. And so in the long run, this saves the Bureau of Land Management a lot of money that they can put toward reproduction fertility control. So to date, we've seen about 5,800 horses adopted for that program, and it gets better and better every month. So I expect we'll see a lot more horses adopted through that program. There's a group, the ASPCA and HSUS and the Return to Freedom and the Farm Bureau and SBA came forward with a proposal and took it to the Appropriations Committee. It's a 10-year plan to increase fertility control, focus mainly on PZP, to use non-lethal gathers every year, and then to increase adoption of horses and burros, especially east of the Mississippi. Most of the adoptions seem to be west of the Mississippi. And so the big question is whether they can gear up to do this. It'll be interesting to see. This isn't a lot different than what's been done in the past, and it's on a grander scale. And if they can find enough contractors to gather more horses, and we can put PCP in any horses that are returned to the range, I think it'll have a positive effect. Cliff is going to talk about this a lot more later, but it's the omnibus bill would provide the BLM an additional $21 million if they would complete a comprehensive plan on how they're going to aggressively resolve the issue that we're dealing with. And so their plan, which is pretty aggressive, is to gather and remove about 18 to 20,000 horses annually, knowing that we've only done about 6,000, up to 11,000 a couple of years ago. But that's an increase. And the question is, are there enough contractors that handle the animals properly and safely that can be found to do that? Treat 3,500 to 9,000 annually with PZP, keeping in mind that on average during this program, we've only put in about 600 horses a year. Place about 6,000 to 7,000 into private care. I think that can be done with the incentive program. They're looking for more additional off-range pastures at this time. They have some pretty strict regulations, and so it's often difficult for ranchers to qualify. Streamline transportation logistics for moving animals around. And then I think this is if we're going to solve the problem, this is how we're going to do it, is we're going to identify partner organizations that will permanently take large numbers of animals and care for them the rest of their lives, and remove the burden from the BLM of warehousing horses so they can put that money into research and fertility control, and then to continue to research into other ways of fertility control. So that's a pretty quick run through the program. If I can figure out how to get back to you, Cliff. Bet. Thanks.
Yep. Do we have any questions for Dr. Lenz?
So tell me what you mean by, Marianne, by what you mean by behavioral management strategies.
This is Marianne. Nice to meet you. What we proposed in our advisory board, and it was based on proposals previous to that Dr. John Turner and I had put together going way back into the 70s, where we were doing video flyovers for accurate video numbers, because the way the BLM was doing it was not accurate at all. We also had very consistent data of 2 to 4% reproductive rates. And so we had been studying different things. He was working with Jay Kirkpatrick doing the fertility work out there, but I was out there studying the behavioral ecology of wild horses. So when I did the work for the National Academy of Sciences in the 70s on the range data, I really felt that they were going to use the behavioral data. And when I say that, we found that functional bonded pairs, meaning long-term pair bondeds, and that was easily identified with the groups using even just flyovers and the ranchers, had the lowest reproductive rates. And that has been fairly consistent. And what we saw happen is that as soon as they started doing gate cuts and bringing those horses in, the reproductive rates just spiked within a few years. So it went from 2%, 4%. The youngest mare that came in the Rock Spring gather was 4 years old that was in foal, the first gather. And within a few years, you started seeing 4-year-olds, and then after a few years, 3-year-olds. And what was happening is they were turning out some of these bachelor stallions, they were starting to destroy the functional bands. And so we've watched those numbers go up. So what we did is we proposed a behavioral strategy that identified functional leadership in the herd, and it was a unanimous from our advisory board. We wrote a very detailed strategic plan on how to maintain, manage, and observe the behavioral herd wisdom of each herd to make these herds unique enough so that the American public wanted them. Because if you remember the Kiger horses, that was a marketing campaign.
Right. Yeah.
With Josh Warburton and Rick, we started it because I was working with the Equine Marketing Association back then, and did a paper on how wild horses can solve the domestic horse industry problems, and had a whole lot of Wolf Coburn at the time from Germany wanted them in Equitana. I mean, there was a huge demand. So having been involved with this program since 1976, 73, now I've been asked many times to be on the advisory board again, and I've said no, because there hasn't been the political will to do any of the proposals, including fund the program privately. And I am a wildlife biologist, so I even had the support for the wildlife people by saying, if you can't hunt them or eat them, we can't manage them. And if the kindest way is shoot them on the range, but shoot the whole band. Don't go in and do all of what we're doing. So what we've seen is a consistent increase, a consistent disorganization. And I had a conversation with Dan Rubenstein at Princeton, because he did the foreword for my book coming out. Has a lot on the wild horse data. And he has consistent data around the world, from Przewalski horses to zebras, that is absolutely consistent with the same data from the 70s, which is identify your critical pair bonding pair. If you don't have one, that herd is going to be exponentially increasing younger fillies, because you don't have the protection that you would if you identified strong stallions. The other thing we identified was that the ranchers were very interested still in keeping ranch horses. And in those areas, our advisory board thought that was a great idea. You keep taking those tough bachelor stallions out of the population, and they don't harass the older stallions that are stable. So what we've seen in the last few years, and I have a lot of photographic documentation of it from the photographers, is that these stallions that were pair bonded for 10 years, 8 years, very strong group of mares around them. When they did gate cuts and threw other stallions out and the population started getting higher and higher with these bachelor bands, they became like piranha, absolute piranha, picking the mares, beating them up, beating up the stallion to where they've had to euthanize a lot of the good stallions because the mares had PCP and they couldn't get foaled, they couldn't get pregnant. So our recommendation strategy at the time was when you see piranha bachelor bands like that, you take all those bachelors out, remove them from the population. So it was a behavioral model. It was clearly identified using biologists of how do you do this. And at the time, the BLM said, well, we don't have any equid biologists. So we actually found them a few, and they chose not to hire them. So that's what I mean by behavioral management.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I have not heard a lot of discussion about that, honestly. I have been involved in a lot of discussion about euthanizing the horses, the whole herd, right? And doing away from primarily animal ethicists and equine behavior specialists, because they say that the emotional stress where you gather a band and break up the band and move them around and put them in different corrals and transport them and so forth is pretty traumatic, and it's more humane just to euthanize them on the range. But I think the big problem we have today is that the public through Congress is managing the horses rather than the scientists and BLM. And so that's what's got us where we are right now. And of course, the question is whether we can get out of this or not. But I sympathize with you not being wanting to be back on the board, because it's probably, I've served on, I want to guess, hundreds of committees, advisory boards in my life. And this is the most frustrating I've ever seen, because there are logical, unemotional, common sense solutions that will never be utilized, right?
Well, I admire you. Thank you for being on it, because many, many years ago, John Bolt told me when I came out of University of Wyoming, and I was all eager to help. And he said, don't waste your time, little miss. There aren't going to be any wild horses left in 10 years. That was in 1976.
Yep.
So our advisory board was the one that got the humane societies more involved and got public affairs committee. It was the only agency in the United States in the government that did not have a public affairs person. So at least they did that, and they started partnering with people.
Yeah.
So I've told others I'm here to help from a database and a knowledge base and historical. If there's anything you need, studies, data, I'm happy to provide them to you, Tom.
Good. Thank you.